Hey everybody, how you guys doing? Hope you guys are doing okay. Another day here in Berkeley, with traffic outside and all that. So yeah, gonna try to do another talk here on Anaximander and Anaximenes, who are the two of the Milesians, the other two other than Thales. So we are going to be talking about first Anaximander, a student of Thales, and then Anaximenes, a student of Anaximander. So Anaximander, who is the second of the three after Thales of the Milesians, the early cosmology philosophers of ancient Greece, with the first three Milesians being, these being the second and the third, the early Greek philosophers who really were more concentrating on cosmology, on how elements work, and that is what they are remembered for. And then their thinking and how elements work, whether it's how they think or not, becomes part of a bunch of other Greek philosophy for Plato and Aristotle and Stoics and others. So these guys are influential, and then we soon after the Milesians and Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, you then have Greek philosophy starting to be more Socratic and Heraclitean and Socratic, although first we'll have Pythagoras, who will be interesting next time. That you start to have it more about life, also with Pythagoras, and how should you live the good life. These guys are a bit more cosmologists, and they're talking about water, fire, and air, but they do believe the elements are just or unjust. So they are talking about ethical life. They're just also talking about physics, when fire and water like to eat each other or obey the gods or not. So some say Anaximander was a student of Thales, and that's what has been said. We don't know that, and many question that today. So it's also the same with Plato. Plato probably didn't know Socrates personally. He says he did, and then effectively he's like, oh, Plato was sick and a dog ate his homework at the moment he was supposed to be there by Socrates' side at the end. So yeah, bad form that. But Plato, says he was sort of a student of Socrates, or his uncle sort of does as Plato's character. But we'll get to all of that along the way. And we have a ways to go. We would certainly have to cover Pythagoras before Plato. But Anaximander, the guy we're talking about right now, supposedly lived around 610 to 546 BCE, other side of Jesus, the far side of Jesus, kind of like Pink Floyd, I guess. So Anaximander had a very famous student, though. If he was not the student of Thales, and if Socrates was not the teacher of Plato anyways, he did have a famous student named Pythagoras. So Pythagoras is the next guy, and Pythagoras supposedly visited Thales after he visited Anaximander. Thales told him to go study in Egypt. That's what we're told, probably by Diogenes Laertius. I don't have that right here. But yeah, probably he would be the one to say that. And did any of these guys go to Egypt or not? Well, they definitely thought they should have, or learn to do triangles like the Egyptians. So a bit of trigonometry and talk of triangles and all that. So as we have none of Thales' writings, Anaximander is technically the first preserved written lines of Greek philosophy, technically one fragment, and we often get these fragments out of the works of others who've recorded them. His On Nature, unlike the works of Homer and Hesiod, but like the treatises written by the Sumerians, Egyptians, and others like that, with similar-ish titles, is not poetry, but it's prose, unstructured by rhythmic constraints. And that is that some of these texts that the Egyptians and Persians and others have written beforehand are not verse or stories of the gods. They are, well, do this, do that. These are some minerals and lists of minerals and applications. While people invoke the gods a lot in texts, and sometimes do before talking about minerals, there would definitely be times when people just start talking kind of in long form. And this is one of those moments. This is one of the moments when, just by happenstance and only in a fragment, Greek philosophy that seems to not be poetry or song is written down for the first time. This is not the first time anybody argued in ancient Greece, or modern Greece for that matter, that in a way that wasn't in song. But this is one of the first fragments of philosophy that's not poetry. Like the Mayans and the Aztecs, philosophy that we often have then is not simply, but is often in the form of poetry and song, which would express thought. So The book is lost. Supposedly that was the book, but a fragment of it is quoted by Simplicius, which is a heck of a name. Not going to do the Monty Python routine I want to do. In his commentary on Aristotle's physics, the things that are perish into the things out of which they come to be, according to necessity. For they pay penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice in accordance with the ordering of time. So like Newton, who believed that God was the mind of the universe, there's balance, and what Anaximander's fragment is telling us is that the seasons and the fire and the water and the heat of the summer and the cold of the winter are in balance because they're animals and they kind of eat each other in the whole ecosystem, which of course, how would you know there is somewhat of the ecosystem? And paying penalty, this sounds like a human society. This sounds like we're having justice amongst the seasons. They perish and they live and they perish like animals, and then they pay penalty and retribution. Well, animals don't pay taxes or retribution, really. Sort of. A dog turns on another dog after a dog bites it in the leg. Like my cats, well, they don't turn on dogs, they turn on each other. But yeah, I don't let them. But yeah, basically, this is the seasons turning on each other, round and round, and also consuming each other, like animals or families or orders of successions of empires, etc. So this and the ordering of time brings about the revolution, the rise and the fall of the things. There's a lot of rise and fall. You do find in early polytheistic society a lot of wisdom. Things rise and fall, like Archilochos said. There isn't necessarily such permanent fixed stability like with later monotheism, and one can also say secularism with belief in science and as Nietzsche says, science in the modern nation state. People probably feel the trust and feel the meaning much more regularly, one could say, all together, interwoven, regardless of how we are back and forth. Much more than people in the ancient world who would be advising people as they grow up, remember things rise and remember they fall, and they kind of go up and down, which we still like and is beautiful. And you can understand why ancient people told themselves a bit more that than the progress of science or religion in the Catholic Church is just steadily going to the whole globe, and that is a wonderful thing, and we're gaining stability. Whether or not you feel like that, they would not feel like that. They would not feel like they're building empires that conquer the whole world. Yet. They would be more polytheistic people trying to survive amongst a tangle of forces and a warring family of different tribes, a warring family of different people in the family and powers that be in the villages that are much more back and forth when they are more oral and becoming, as we're talking, more and more literate. Remember, literacy in text is very rare. That's not only why we only have this fragment, but there was a whole book. There weren't many books back then. This is one of them. In fact, annoyingly, as love to joke, almost every book in Greek thought, all the way up through even Middle Age thought that incorporated a lot of Greek things in the Latin, would be named on nature. It's like that is pretty much your book on physics, which also just includes ethics and psychology and any other random fire and light and whatever else is spiritual. That materially and spiritually all wanders together as physics and chemistry and angels and spirits and gods and anything else, and that's all on nature. This is again why another good point. It's not that these are the first scientists. They're talking about the material. Yes, is full of gods, and pretty much all the Hawaiians and everyone is talking about nature and water and fire, and it's full of energy and life. And it's like that's not really spiritualism as opposed to materialism. Actually, you got to have sort of a weird way of a lot of culture before you even begin to discuss what the heck is spiritualism versus materialism. We'd have to be past other cultures. We're like, well, that there over there is, they don't have that, especially if this is a fragment of a text. So, not only our own perspective consuming theirs, and then theirs consuming ours, as we have the same Idaeus up in the Theophanies here, but that, yeah, there are ways where Zeus is balance, and he's a big jerk of a guy. Dike, technically, is balance itself, and then Zeus presides over all of that. So in a certain sense, Dike, Zeus's daughter, and again, well, Zeus is all over everything. But yes, hopefully he leaves order and balance and justice somewhat alone. And yes, is basically presiding over justice as one of his aspects. This is similar later monotheistic God, who isn't Zeus but just God, would have angels as the voice, Michael as the might, Gabriel as the voice, similar aspects of a being that then is almost immobile, such that if it speaks, it would be an angel or a god. Zeus is on the path here somewhat from, in the day of these Milesians, they are somewhat between polytheism and monotheism. is what I like to say, and then leave that just as open as that sounds. So they are wrestling with how there are many gods, and then these are Greek philosophers who, like in India and China, are talking about there is truth, there is being. They're using words about words. Think about the word word and how you could use words without having the word word for a long time. The word truth is a word about words. This is all philosophy, very much, and the people who talk about anything like words, Aztec, or I believe earlier Mayan poetry says, are these words true? If so, are no words true? If so, these words are not true. Words about words about words. Apparently they had the word words in Mayan. I don't know what it is. But if they did, then they could be somewhat philosophical in talking about words, and thus talking about talking. Talk is also a word you would not need immediately. You would need stick or rock. You would not need the word talk. You could just talk to people. So meta, bro. And yes, you can talk, you can words, you can word, and again, me talk pretty. One day, traffic now, still outside. You know, I am going to just leave the window open. It's hot. It's terrible. But also, yeah. And the computer's going to be a little bit noisy. I actually have a silent fan on the way. That would be air, water, fire, and some sort of electrical combination here. Hopefully Zeus will be a little bit more monotheistic in continuing to provide the lightning. You know what I mean? Yeah, otherwise the safe ways are all going to go out. So Dike is the goddess who has scales and is the blind goddess Justice. It is not, I am not clear, and I do not have any sources saying she was blindfolded in ancient Greece, although that is how she is sometimes presented. Again, I don't know exactly when she was blindfolded. That is a loose end on my part. But she is similar in some ways to something like Anubis in Egypt is standing before scales. He is not blindfolded, but a god who is using scales. In Egypt, China, India, and Greece, they would have scales in their lives as they get civilized and they are trading amongst many different types of people with many different types of practices. That would be when you would need any math at all, and also when you would also need specialized practices and all of this so that you could trade salaries among specialized kind of people, different types of money, currency. So Dike is on the scales, and there are many examples in Chinese, Indian, and Greek thought of being on the scales of justice, or having the scales, and you'd need to have physical scales to have that kind of talk about the gods. In fact, you could even say, if we're not so mythological, you claim, recently I have heard it claimed, and I would trust and not go off your meds with the psychologists, but to distrust all of psychology, not really, or jump around on a couch, is that, yeah, people have been saying, hey, we have chemical balances or imbalances in our heads. Technically, that's a very useful metaphor, and I will leave this up to those who really know about serotonin, but technically, you're not balancing chemicals against each other. You are maintaining, say, certain chemicals, but you're not really balancing them. But then again, I'll let experts say that. I have heard that from experts criticizing experts, not personally, but in print, that, yeah, there really isn't a chemical balance in the head either, but you just say balance as a metaphor, it'll serve perfectly fine for coordinating human activity, which is, of course, how we are all decently metaphorical, and I am trying to stand for here, of course, the rationality and the kind of scientificness, not just of Anaximander, but of the ancient world, including the Indians, Egyptians, Chinese, and everybody. They would have used scales as a metaphor, understood things, try to talk about science in the abstract without using concrete metaphors. Is a really good point I always like to make. So, and religion, and politics, and art, and any other form of abstraction. As many fine folks who like metaphors will say, as soon as you start talking about invisible things like time, the self, truth, which aren't really invisible, you can see a look on somebody's face, but you will soon find metaphor right there, and that's okay, that's human. Remember that when you're judging other cultures, of course. They have the metaphors and the scales they have, because they have scales they weigh gold coins on. If they didn't have doubloons, yes, they did not have doubloons before the Spanish. But yes, they essentially would be weighing coins and coins and meat and garlic and salt and everything else, and tea and sugar and, whatever they could get their hands on from India, etc. So, sugarcane and tea, green tea, I believe, come originally from India to China, and everybody else, I'm not sure, and the Islamic world, I believe that is true, if I am not mistaken. Certainly sugarcane, possibly also the green tea, but I don't, black tea certainly, green tea possibly. Yes, I am angering tea historians as I speak. That's all right. Again, how many of them are there? We can take them on. For Anaximander, it's a town where we need to get in a fight with people, over the brewing. For Anaximander, the basic element out of which spring the others is not water, but like with Thales, his supposed teacher, he was following him anyway, whether or not they met, but the limitless, the infinite apeiron, unlimited by time or space, essentially infiniteness as an element. There are Indian philosophers like Jains and Buddhists and others who do talk about nothing or endlessness or consciousness as a physical element in the list with water, air, earth, and fire. And rather than make sense of that any more than say that, he is actually treating infinite somethingness without any sort of particular quality at all as the physical air fire element out of which they all come. Sort of something like energy, although as always mentioned, when talking about Heraclitus, for us energy is electricity, and for the ancients electricity was often fire and the heat in the body that leaves when you die. Energy is everything, so it's everything cold, everything warm, and you could say a lack of energy is coldness versus heat, but in a certain sense, if everything is energy, then coldness would be energy in another state rather than heat as actual energy. What does energy do? Bunch up against itself? Possibly, and again, I'm no physicist, and I'll leave that to them. But in a certain sense, if all is energy and being and stuff, then hot is energy, cold is energy, everything, hunger is energy, as Heraclitus says, thirst is energy. So essentially, all is infinite, and infinite some kind of potential energy, I think, is a way we could easily interpret this in the way I'm going to mangle it for us today. Anaximander basically says it was unborn and will not die. That is very interesting and important, because Heraclitus would actually say, if you believe in gods that are born at a certain point, those are stupid gods, they are going to die. He says something to this effect in 2 or 3 different ways, and you would have to interpret that. But Heraclitus, whether or not he does believe fully in, and he talks as if he sort of does and doesn't, the gods, he believes that gods are not born or dying unless they're very mortal, imperfect beings who like blood and battle, and Heraclitus does not like the idea of gods above us. He likes the idea of many gods, it seems, but he does not like the idea of a goddess gloating and enjoying blood and being like, all right, there's a war, and goddesses being like, hell yeah. He does not like that. He thinks that's evil and terrible, and the gods and goddesses would be above us. They're still anthropomorphic. They're still weirdly like a family. But just like a monotheistic god is even further above that and even more abstract, yet can love and care, unlike Cthulhu, who does not love and care about us, according to Lovecraft. Again, more like Epicurus, just floats the heck through life as giant octopus god being, which is not caring god, is just uncaring animal thing, which is some of what they're considering here materially and spiritually, because it's all energy and fire and light and spirit and material and stuff. It seems, because they don't seem to have parsed that the way we would and have specialized practices such that we'd think of the spiritual versus the material or have words like that entirely. So in interpreting this, the apeiron is something like energy itself, and it isn't born or dying, which means, because it's infinite, that's not like stupid ideas of the gods and polytheistic gods. Think about how a monotheist or a secular rationalist, who also has a brain, would be able to debate, well, wait a minute, if your polytheistic gods were born at a certain time and all-powerful, why are your temporary beings, if they were born at a certain time, I'm going to imagine they're imperfect, and they die at a certain time, otherwise why weren't they always? And as I may have actually already ranted, I believe in one of these videos, begotten not made in the Catholic sort of creed and language actually means Jesus gets to be sort of God, not God, but also co-eternal, which means technically Jesus was born of a virgin but never born. Which again is, well, yes, it's interesting systems. I am not a doctrinal Catholic, but that would actually be, historically, and I heard those things as a kid, that is, my mother's Catholic, that basically that is the way that these gods that the people would believe that there are material processes, and if you are talking about a god, a polytheistic god, how would that be born at a certain time? It would have to neither be born nor die, and yes, I did make this point a bit, I believe, in another of the videos. I don't recall which. It also could have been for the Buddhist and Hindu class. Well, for the Buddhist philosophy class, when ranting about Hinduism or Jainism, because this sort of thing actually becomes Buddhism saying all is impermanent, like Heraclitus very much as far as we can tell, and then others claiming, like Plato, like Pythagoras, who will be next, and Plato is very Pythagorean, numbers and certain ideas are eternal. That would definitely be an interesting way of saying it, of course, because in these debates you could say, but if gods are born, then they're imperfect gods and they will die, unlike the infinite. And here, much like the infinite, we can certainly say, well, I believe something more in like a nameless infinite rather than something like gods and seasons that eat each other. There is an interesting way here where people who would believe, like Pythagoras and Plato, that numbers and ratios seem eternal and perfect in certain ways. Somebody more Buddhist or Heraclitean, possibly Aniaximander himself, though he doesn't say, would probably say that numbers and divisions of things are temporary understandings and cannot be the eternal superior sorts of structures, which gets all the way to philosophy debates today, because you would still have pragmatism and positivism, one can effectively say, duking it out over whether or not things are simply the practices endlessly and infinitely, like the apeiron, or whether or not they are limited and chunked as formal, such that they have their actual form, let's say, and that form is somehow both ideal but thus completely, truly, and actually the deep real. These are issues these guys are wrestling with, and Anaximander is one of the Greeks early on to actually believe in the infinite. Aristotle is not, much as was just saying. Plenty of people do not like the idea of things being unfixed, would definitely, like Aristotle and many mathematicians today, not say that math or logic are unfixed and kind of cultural or temporary. In fact, even then this gets in issues, were math and logic born in their form at a certain time? Well, I would say if I were Darwinian enough, certainly they'd have to be. In fact, math may be a recent occurrence. Using words for 2, 3, and 5, if don't sleep, there are snakes, is to be believed. I do recommend that book. But there are people very quickly here with Pythagoras and then with Plato and Aristotle, Plato's student, and he was actually Plato's student, unlike the others we were talking about, that it is formal. Unlike an infinite, something that does not seem to have particular qualities or quantities as the sort of formless essence of everything. You will notice a back and forth here of fluid and solid elements somewhat. And these early cosmologists are trying to show how the formed rises out of the formless, how more solid elements like earth rise out of water for Thales, and here the elements themselves rise out of the formless infinite. It is very like Taoism of China, like a lot of Indian philosophy, and you can go to the lake in Egypt still today, where, I believe Memphis, where you can essentially see, which is the Greek name, that you can, at Luxor, etc., that you can see where the universe supposedly arose as the solid and the earth out of the water. How it's a lake surrounded by earth, how it got in its pajamas, I do not know. But yes, the fluid and the infinite give rise to the firmament and the permanent. That is, and where do numbers and forms of reality come from? Along with the interaction of us and others. So, yes, deep understandings. Whether or not we live in an openet or an openet, yes, that's a new word. An openet is an open infinite universe. Openet. I am very openet about several things, including my use of the word openet. And we live in an openet infinite universe, or we possibly live in a closed universe. There's been some more stuff discovered in Hawaii in recent years that suggest actually the universe may be speeding up and slowing down, so the old it comes out of somewhere and is just slowing down may be wrong. I definitely heard in an astro class many years ago that we do not know if we live in an open or a closed universe. So in that sense, we do not know possibly whether we live in an open-ended or closed universe, which means we do not know if Anaximander is technically right in that way. With all of the power and the science and the religious traditions, polytheistic leading to monotheism, leading to the secularization and further specialization of the sciences and practices in our day through China to Islam to European infighting and then colonialism and everything going outward. That yes, we still don't know all of that. Anaximander says the elements are opposed to each other, with fire being hot, water being wet, earth being dry, and air being cool. Many people probably thought something like this, and this is not probably first in ancient Greece, because probably folks had this earlier in other cultures and were systematizing things much like this in other ways. Anaximander is setting this out in print as far as we have quoted from somebody else in a fragment. So he is somebody who is putting down an idea here. This sort of scheme, along with similar ones in China and other stuff, are the basics of something like a periodic table, that Earth is dry and cool, etc., as opposed to wet and cool. And there are images you can find. I have one on the site. Modern images of drawing that out. It is, of course, sort of, well, it is, you could make a simple graph in any form and show how things share and overlap in a Venn-like diagram, those ways. So, Anaximander actually argued, this is what Aristotle and others, in covering all of these kinds of things and arguing about them, that we know he argued, because otherwise without Aristotle and others saying blah, 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 Anaximander blah, that we would not be able to understand, so what was this guy and what was he saying at all, and is he getting him right? Well, we have to triangulate as best we can. Anaximander seems to have argued that Thales was wrong, that water is the primary element of the cosmos, because otherwise everything would have been, all fire would have gone out by now, or maybe never would have arisen. Anaximander's argument is energy itself can neither be hot nor cold, nor wet nor dry, the energy which is the stuff of the universe, because if it has any quality itself, it would have obliterated the other quality long ago. Where would the quality opposite arise from? Perhaps in some potential, but then wouldn't the universe have cooled down by now if it was made of cool rather than warm? Well, yeah, I mean, it sort of would. So it would be any sort of oppositional qualities arising out of something which is potentially, but does not have sort of in just itself any other thing. I used to like watching the Animaniacs, and in Logic there is the bit with the planet where people are afraid of everything, the planet of afraid of everything, and the aliens, not people on the planet, are like, something green, and then as they're flying away, it's like, something not green. And of course, green and not green exhaust the universe of discourse, but you wouldn't have to say anything like that if things were all green or not green. We wouldn't have words for green, and thus we would certainly not have the word not green. That would be really weird. So, being itself, as Hegel says, cannot be green. It can't be not green, as like Animaniacs would tell you, because that would be different things. And if it's the same underlying being and stuff and energy, it couldn't be hot or cold or green or not green, because there's cold things and hot things and green things and not green things. And they're things. Is the underlying, if one wants theory, psychology, instincts, mind state that underlies a lot of human thought, and this is not new and scientific, it's actually just sort of human wrangling and reasoning with seasons, elements. You're trying to lash down your hut and deal with fire and water and different elements, and by the time it reaches city-states, people are starting to collect quotes and texts of quotes of guys yammering like Anaximander. And Anaximander's argument, actually, is quite powerful and interesting, and it will be one that you find in Hegel in the 1800s, early 1800s in his Logic. And Hegel's Logic is something important to folks even today. Contemporary political issues are folks who are influenced by or hate Hegel's Logic plenty in complicated ways I'm not going to talk about right now, but are certainly a thing. And yeah, you can ask Marcuse about all of that. But there is a very basic Hegelian and even modern point to make, that if energy stuff being whatever department you want to stick it into, it's probably in all of them, if things are things, it wouldn't be cold or warm, would it? And it wouldn't be set, closed or open, would it? And it wouldn't be fair or unfair, would it? It wouldn't really be one thing or the other, would it? Because if it was one thing rather than the other thing, there's a basic sort of thing, well, how would that have come about, So anyway, it was primarily cold, how could it be hot, and why wasn't hot obliterated long ago? That doesn't mean there aren't theological, scientific explanations that would then try to plug the gap, and that would be where you would have that. People would say, well, because, and then obviously none of that is impossible to think, and that's fine. This is an interesting argument, and it is somewhat strangely compelling, that energy itself could not be green or not green. So therefore, it couldn't really be alive or dead, or it couldn't really be mathematical or unmathematical, because if it was one thing rather than the other, why wasn't it the other thing all along? Or not at all by now? It is odd. So, for Anaximander, he goes on to say that lightning and thunder come from clouds bumping into each other is a settling of the injustice amongst the elements. The infinite is a negative thing, again, to Pythagoreans and Aristotle. They want something more like a limited if you think of Aristotelian logic, Aristotle doesn't really like zero so much. The Mayans were all right with it. In the medieval ages, at some point, I read in a great book that Muslims were using zero by that point, although they had struggles over that. And then from India, the zero and the Indian Arabic numerals, and then Europeans learned Indian Arabic numerals, and as we were learning the numbers we still use, which are weirdly similar to Chinese numbers in drawn out ways, and the whole history of all of that, with cultural splittings from India into the Muslims one way, the Chinese another way, with the same numbers taking different forms that are scratched out but seem kind of weirdly similar. Europeans would go to places. A German merchant would send his son to Italy to learn secretly about zero. Like, there was a point at which the Pope, around 1200, condemned zero, and you couldn't learn about it. And so, but you would just, if you wanted to make money, you just go learn about numbers and zero anyway. So you send your kid to Italy for a while. You know, that was a real thing around 1200 for Europeans. While Indians and Muslims had zero, so were the Mayans already. You know, in fact, they were possibly, burning out a little bit by that point. But yeah, the Mayans getting going like 800 something. Anyway, I am going to get better about the Mayans and Mayan philosophy. I intend on doing it. There is always so much to do. I've gotten a lot better about Egypt lately. The Mayans are on the list, as well as the Pishtako, who think white people, religious or scientific, are strange ogres who steal their children's fat to grease the church bells and planes that zoom overhead. It is a beautiful, strange, and interesting world. Those would be the descendants of the Incans, who still survive as tribes today in remote parts of Peru and occasionally get shot at by the army. So, according to Aniaximander now, to come back to it, the Aniaximander's own cosmology, similar to plenty of Mayan stuff and other things, the world grew out of a seed encased in fire and air, which then fell apart into rings, which then composed the sun, moon, planets, and stars. And this still is as much as we know it is, and it's hard to say exactly several things precisely about that if that's all you kind of know. Anaximander supposedly introduced the gnomon, the sundial stick in the ground, which the Babylonians and Egyptians had earlier. It has been said Anaximander invented it, and unfortunately I do continuously report a lot of stuff it seems the Greeks invented. They did something to it, but again, a lot of times if you just cut history off at Greece, it was cutting it off at Rome for Catholics, plenty for a while, now then for Protestants it's plenty cutting it off at Greece. We live still in Protestant power hours, so when you look at Babylon and Egypt, it's like, no, Anaximander didn't invent that. Herodotus wasn't the father of all history. Plato pretty is sure the Egyptians had history for thousands of years before the Greeks, and they did. Plato actually thinks it's 9,000 years old, and the Egyptians are probably not 9,000 years old, but they're thousands of years old, earlier than the Greeks. So the gnomon-like history is actually older than Greece, and Anaximander did not invent it, just as Herodotus did not actually invent history or travel logs. That is something earlier, but at the same time, if one is connecting oneself to the Greeks and not the Egyptians or the Sumerians or Babylonians, those are all lands occupied by Muslims in the current day. If one was tracing oneself back to one's Christian heritage, though, and bypassing the Romans, you would essentially have, with the New Testament written in Greek, the Greeks. So that would be why some people think Anaximander invented the gnomon sundial, which is a stick, which is kind of Babylonian and Egyptian long before. It is actually Thales, like Pythagoras, is said to have figured out in Egypt the first time trigonometry by doing it himself and measuring this and the shadow of that and the reflection. Technically, of course, why would the Egyptians put the pyramids together, not figure out reflecting the top of it through a pool, and then the Greek guy came along and was brilliant that way? Well, it's probably we're not, the Egyptian stuff is kind of lost. Some of the Greek fragments are preserved. We celebrate the Greeks. So probably if you're going to Egypt, looking at triangles that people have measured and doing geometry, earth measuring, magic, science stuff, you probably would, have trigonometry and be able to measure the top of the pyramid yourself as Egyptians, and then Thales and Pythagoras are like, hey, what's going on over in this side of the town? And ancient Greece was 2 weeks away by sailboat in the ancient Greek heyday. So it's not like they weren't continuously taking boats back and forth to Egypt, or like the Egyptians could have pulled the pyramids together without understanding, hey, you can look at the top of it reflected at this angle, and yes. It's again, we actually have records of some of the Greek stuff. A lot of the Egyptian stuff, again, is destroyed, lost, in lands occupied, still lived in by their modern cultures, and who are tracing themselves back to the ancient Egyptians as modern Egyptian, many Muslim people. in North Africa. So yes, that is, again, all complicated history, and I'm getting off on a tangent, given the elements and the stars and the spheres. So, speaking of which, the Anaximander, looking at the gnomon that he got from other people and also used probably plenty and in new, interesting, weird ways in Greece, says the sun and the moon make full circles, which of course they're actually more, well, yes, it's kind of elliptical, but again, yes. Passing beneath the earth, and the earth floats unsupported in space. It's odd because it would be unsupported by water or air or Atlas, like as a dude, or a pillar, or turtles, all the way down, or anything, which makes it different from other cultures. It wasn't until other people got into space, thousands of years later, that people could observe all of that. I was talking with an awesome student yesterday, and he was talking about how flat Earth is believable. And again, I mentioned, well, it seems from our evidence is woven together from your eyes, your ears, everything, and it seems like the Earth is flat, and we are dealing with a lot of flat earthers here, and we're dealing with a lot of intelligent design folk, regardless of what you feel about intelligent design or flat Earth, or because we are dealing with the part of the evidence people could see at the time, is the easiest way to talk about Hawaiians, Greeks, Indians, everyone. So, of course, they did think the Earth was a flat disk, but then floating in space with Anaximander, some of them. And that is not us, because that would be flat disk Earth floating in space, which is more like modern flat Earth kind of theory. Interesting, weirdly enough, which is what my student was writing his paper about. We were talking all about it. So, for Homer and Hesiod, the world is like a pillar or a drum. For the poets who make Greek society, and then Anaximander is actually fleshing out more theoretically or scientifically are wrong words here that people often use, but he is sort of talking out as best he can without doing the odes to the gods what Homer and Hesiod have pretty much already said, which is that there is like a drum or a cylinder, like a column, like a Greek column, was a pillar or a drum that is supporting the heavens, like columns supporting the roof of a temple, which would all be physical things you can see. And that's the shape of the cosmos. The Earth is flat because, of course, a cross-section of a pillar would be a flat space. Not that necessarily there's nothing, I don't know here if it's specified if there's other sides off the disk. And that is sort of a problem, I guess, here with the theory and or us hearing only this about it. But that things fall downward. And in this picture, it should be noted, it's interesting, gravity doesn't go backwards in Australia for these guys. Like, gravity goes down and keeps going downward. Hesiod famously said in the Theogony, however one pronounces it, that it takes an anvil 9 days to fall from the height of heaven to the earth. 9 is 3 times 3. Zeus teams up with, I believe, Poseidon and Hades, if I'm getting that right. And yeah, basically to be much air, fire, earth, water coming together to conquer the Titans and set time and the elements as the gods of primary elemental spheres, and that's a trinity of forces coming together, a top, the middle, and the bottom. 9 is 3 times 3, 9 to the earth. That would mean probably it would take I'm not sure how long for the anvil to fall into Hades, but you would be measuring something like an anvil falling into Hades would be 1 day, and then to the bottom of beneath Hades or wherever the heck is beneath the earth, if there is any space down there, I think for Anaximander there is, the anvil would fall until it hits whatever. I'm not going to speculate here. I don't have anvils or the ancient Greek cosmos at hand. So yes, unless we're there right now and everything's anvils. So, Anaximander also uses the number 9 as the ratio of the length of the Earth to the distance to the stars and in several other places. So, in other words, this is a guy being all sciencey and shaking the ancient Egyptian test tubes with the minerals and the fluids in it and saying, Eureka, I happen to confirm pretty much the theology of my day, polytheistic. And by the way, I'm using the number 9 a lot in a bunch of places, which is nice and rational and logical and argumentative and mathematical, which are human practices of argument and mathematics, which are nice and city-state and starting to get its act together. Having a little bit of the leaf blower. Or what have you. Anyway, yeah, we may end out here on Anaximander a little bit if that noise continues. But yes. So why does the Earth not fall but it floats? So Aristotle said, Anaximander said, the Earth was at the center of the cosmos, and because of this, there's no reason for it to move one way or the other, which is weird because there seems to be a reason for the anvil to fall, and Aristotle doesn't like this argument much. Aristotle says if Anaximander is right, then a man who is hungry and thirsty between food and drink would necessarily remain where he is. Notice, by the way, that for Aristotle, sort of the anvil wants to fall, has a purpose in life, which is going downward with earth. So Aristotle would argue, as a secular person might today, a modern person who is science, someone who believes in science, thus doesn't believe in religion. The funny thing here is that Aristotle, very much like Anaximander, like Thales, thinks all things are full of God and intentions and intentional design, very physically in the world, moving around at stuff. So he actually believes that the earth would not fall down because the earth doesn't want to either go down or up. And he's like, that's like saying, Anaximander, the earth is neither hungry nor thirsty enough to go up or towards food or down towards water, is what he sounds like. Like a plant doesn't know whether or not to go upward and stretch toward the sun like a sunflower, or bury downward into the earth like some kind of mushroom. And that's sort of what he is saying, because he thinks the universe is alive, of course, and thinks primarily in terms of living forces. Speaking of which, yes, all the wildlife outside, there's like squawking birds and a leaf blower, and unfortunately, as with all of this stuff, yeah, there's not really a way of doing these videos other than dealing with all of wildness of life. So, Earth, yeah, the leaf blower and the cosmos is gradually fading into the distance here. So yes, we can come back to Earth. So Anaximander put the stars nearest to Earth, then the planets, then the moon, and farthest away is the sun. It means he thought the stars disappeared because they pass in front of the moon, not behind it, and the moon outshines them at night the way the sun does during the day. The cosmos is shaped like a drum, with the planets on wheels circling around the sides, and the disk of the Earth in the center, rising and falling with the seasons. There is a map, or at least modern depictions of maps, on the website. I stole mine from someone. I believe it is a Creative Commons free image, otherwise I would not have stolen it, which isn't stealing, I swear. Anaximander made a map of the world, supposedly the first in ancient Greece, and again, sometimes he is credited as first cartographer ever, and it's like, well, technically others had maps, you know, and stuff, especially Egyptians doing geometry, earth measuring, and doing math primarily in terms, plenty of that. That Anaximander supposedly made a map of the world, the first of ancient Greece, with the circles of the earth surrounded by the ocean, which presumably also floats in place. The Mediterranean Sea is in the center of the earth. Delphi is the navel at the very center. The northern part of the world is Europe. The eastern part of the world is Asia. And the southern half, Libya. I cannot do this anymore. God fucking damn it. Stupid fucking bastards.